The stove hadn't lit in years. He went to clean it, then saw the straw shift and the tiniest hand curl around a nail. The air in the cabin was a solid thing, a block of ice carved to the shape of the room. John Merle breathed it in and felt it freeze his lungs from the inside out. It was a familiar cold. It had been his only companion since Martha's breath had misted the window for the last time, 3 winters past. He moved through the single room like a ghost haunting his own grave, his boots scuffing a thin layer of dust that never truly settled. The dust was made of everything that was gone, skin and wood smoke and the pollen from flowers she'd once insisted on keeping in a jar on the sill. Now the jar was gone, the sill was bare, and the dust was just dust. Outside, the wind howled a hymn for old Smelter Row, a place the world had forgotten. The skeletons of the smelter stacks clawed at a perpetually gray sky, monuments to a prosperity that had packed up and left decades ago. Even the rats had given up. There was nothing left to scavenge. He'd woken with the same ache behind his eyes that met him every morning. It was the pressure of unspoken words, of memories that had nowhere to go. His gaze fell on the great cast-iron stove that dominated the far wall. It was a relic, older than the cabin itself, a black, pot-bellied god of a hearth that hadn't known fire since before Martha had taken to her bed. It was her stove, really. She'd loved its ornate scrollwork, the way it held the heat through the bitterest nights. After she was gone, he couldn't bring himself to light it. The warmth would have felt like a lie. He'd used the small utilitarian cook stove instead, a sad little box of metal that offered no comfort, only function. The big stove had become a tomb, a place to store things that had no other place. Old rags, a broken harness, a bundle of straw he'd meant to use for patching the roof but never had. Today, the sight of it offended him more than usual. It was a monument to his own inertia. Its cold, black mouth seemed to mock the stillness of the room. He would clean it. He would gut it. He would scrape it down to the bare iron, and maybe, that would scrape something clean inside himself. It was a fool's hope, but it was enough to move his feet. He crossed the floor, the boards groaning under his weight. He knelt, the cold of the wood seeping through the thin wool of his trousers. The iron door was stiff. He pulled, and it screeched open on rusted hinges, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. A puff of stale, musty air breathed out at him. It smelled of decay and mouse droppings, though he hadn't seen a mouse in a year. He reached inside, his calloused fingers brushing against the dry, brittle straw. He'd bundle it up, take it outside, burn it. A small fire, at least. A cremation. He gathered a handful, and that's when he saw it. A shift. A slight, almost imperceptible movement deep within the nest of straw. He froze, his hand hovering. The wind, he told himself. A draft through a chink in the flue. But the air in the cabin was dead still. He stared, his eyes adjusting to the gloom inside the stove's belly. The straw was matted and filthy, packed down into a rough circle. In the center of the circle, something was different, a texture that wasn't straw. He squinted. It was a scrap of burlap, impossibly dirty, and beneath it, the movement came again. This time he was sure. It was a deliberate quiver, a living thing. His mind, slow and thick with grief, offered up a list of possibilities. A rat finally returned from its exile, a weasel seeking shelter, a sick raccoon crawled in to die. He felt a surge of irritation. He didn't have the energy for this. He just wanted the stove empty. He reached in again, more forcefully this time, to rake the whole mess out onto the floor. His fingers snagged on something hard, a nail, hammered into the back wall of the stove, likely for hanging a poker that had been lost for ages. And as his fingers brushed the cold iron, he saw the hand. It was not a paw. It was not a claw. It was a human hand, so small it barely seemed real. The fingers were coated in a thick grime of soot and dirt, the nails broken and black. They were curled into a loose fist, resting on the straw. As he watched, his own breath caught in his throat, The tiny fingers uncurled with an agonizing slowness and wrapped themselves around the rusted head of the nail. It was a gesture of ownership, of belonging. "This is mine," the tiny hand seemed to say. "This cold, dark place." John Merle recoiled, as if he'd touched the hot iron the stove was meant to be. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the dusty floorboards until his back hit the opposite wall. He slid down to a sitting position, his heart a wild bird battering against the cage of his ribs. He couldn't breathe. The block of ice in his lungs had shattered into 1,000 sharp shards. A child. There was a child in his stove. It wasn't possible. It was a hallucination, a trick of the grief that had hollowed him out and filled him back up with shadows. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the image, the tiny, soot-blackened hand curling around the nail, but it was burned there, onto the back of his eyelids. He opened his eyes. The cabin was exactly as it had been, the empty chair where Martha used to sit, the gray light filtering through the grimy window pane, the open mouth of the stove. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. He sat there for what felt like an hour, maybe more. Time had become a fluid thing since Martha died. He listened. There was no sound, no cry, no whimper, just the endless, mournful song of the wind outside. Had he imagined it? Was he finally, truly losing his mind? He had to know. He pushed himself to his feet, his knees cracking in protest. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a bear trap. He didn't kneel this time. He crouched, keeping his distance, peering into the blackness. The hand was gone. The straw was still. Had it burrowed deeper? Was it even real? He stayed there, motionless, his eyes straining against the dark. And then, a new detail emerged from the gloom. In the soot on the interior wall of the stove, just above the straw, there were marks, scratches, thin, white lines against the black. They looked like fingernail marks, a desperate, silent counting of days, or hours. His gaze followed them up the curved wall to the stovepipe. There were more scratches there, a frantic ladder leading to a patch of rust. The sheer, stubborn reality of it hit him. The scratches. Someone had been in there long enough to mark the time, long enough to try and claw their way out. His hallucination theory crumbled, leaving him exposed and trembling. There was a person in his stove. A child. He thought of the boot prints he'd occasionally seen in the dust around the cabin, circling the stove, prints too small to be his. He'd dismissed them as tricks of the light, old tracks of his own that the wind had blurred. He thought of the feather he'd found a week ago, a single downy gray feather resting in the cold ash of the cookstove's hearth. He'd picked it up, marveled at its fragility for a moment, then tossed it into the firebox, thinking a bird must have fallen down the chimney. Now he saw it differently, a treasure, a small piece of the outside world, tucked away in a place of ash. He had to get it out. Her out. He cleared his throat. The sound was rough, unused. "Hello?" he croaked. The word died in the heavy air. No response. He tried again, his voice a little stronger, softer. "It's all right. You can come out." Silence. Of course. What child would respond to a strange man's voice beckoning them from the dark? A wild thing cornered, would only burrow deeper. He thought of the trap lines his father had taught him to run as a boy. You don't shout at a fox. You don't rush a rabbit. You wait. You offer something. Food. The thought was so simple, so practical. It was a lifeline. He backed away from the stove, his movements slow and deliberate. He went to the rough-hewn cupboard. His supplies were meager: a sack of flour, a tin of lard, some dried beans, a half loaf of stale bread. He broke off a piece of the bread. It was hard as a rock. He stood for a moment, holding the piece of bread, feeling its unyielding texture. He thought of Martha, how she could take flour and water and turn it into something that made the whole cabin smell of life. His own cooking was a joyless act of necessity. He poured some water from the bucket into the rusty kettle, another of Martha's abandoned things, and set it on the little cook stove. He shaved some kindling, struck a match. The flame was a small miracle in the gloom. The fire caught, and soon the kettle began to hiss. The sound was alien. He couldn't remember the last time he'd boiled water for anything but washing. While it heated, he took the bread and placed it on the floor, about 5 feet from the open stove door. Then he retreated to the far side of the room, sitting on the edge of his cot, making himself as small and unthreatening as possible. He waited. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. The sun began its slow descent, the gray light turning to a bruised purple. The kettle began to whistle, a high, piercing shriek that made him jump. It was a sound of home, a sound of warmth and company, a sound that had been absent for 3 years. He got up quickly and took it off the heat, silencing it. The sudden quiet was more profound than before. He poured the steaming water over another chunk of bread in a bowl, mashing it with a fork until it was a soft, pulpy mush. The smell of wet bread filled the air. It wasn't the smell of Martha's baking, but it was something. He placed the bowl next to the piece of hard bread, then retreated to his cot again. He sat and watched the stove. He didn't dare blink. For a long time, nothing. Then he saw it again. A flicker of movement in the opening, a small head, a tangle of matted hair so dark with grime it blended with the shadows. 2 eyes, wide and white in a face streaked with ash, stared out at the room. They weren't the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of a hunted animal, ancient and wary. The eyes fixed on the bread, then darted to him, then back to the bread. He held his breath. Slowly, agonizingly, a small body began to emerge from the stove. It was a girl. She couldn't be more than 5, maybe 6. She was skeletal, wrapped in a dress that was little more than a collection of rags and filth. She moved on all 4s, a low, cautious crawl, her head held low. Her bare feet were black with soot. She crept towards the food, her gaze never leaving him. Every time a floorboard creaked, she flinched, ready to bolt. She reached the hard bread first. She snatched it, her movements impossibly fast, and scurried back into the mouth of the stove, like a spider retreating to its web. There was the sound of frantic, desperate chewing. He let out the breath he'd been holding. It wasn't enough. She needed more. He waited. After a few minutes, the small, ash-streaked face reappeared. Her eyes were on the bowl now. This was a greater risk. The bowl was farther away, more exposed. She hesitated for a long time, a small, trembling statue of indecision. He tried to soften his gaze, to pour every ounce of reassurance he could muster into the space between them. "I will not hurt you." He didn't say it. He thought it. He hoped she could feel it. She crept out again, this time a little faster. She reached the bowl, plunged her filthy hand into the warm mush, and began to cram it into her mouth. She didn't use her fingers. She used her whole palm, scooping and shoving, her eyes still locked on him. She ate like she might never eat again. Some of the mush dribbled down her chin, tracing clean paths through the grime on her skin. When the bowl was empty, she licked her hand clean, then her arm, as far as her tongue could reach. Then, quick as a flash, she was gone, back into the blackness of the stove. John sat on his cot, his body aching with stillness. The room was nearly dark now. He didn't light a lamp. The darkness felt safer, less intrusive. He had fed a ghost, a wild thing that lived in his wife's cold stove. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what to do. All he knew was that the solid block of ice in his chest had a crack in it. And through that crack, a terrifying, fragile warmth was beginning to seep in. He slept on the cot in his clothes, a fitful, haunted sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, brought him to instant, alert wakefulness. He was listening for a sound from the stove, but there was nothing. He woke before dawn, the habit of a lifetime of work he no longer had. The cabin was frigid. He looked towards the stove. The door was still open. The empty bowl sat on the floor, a pale circle in the gloom. He rose quietly, his joints stiff. He moved to the cook stove, lit a small fire, and put the kettle on. The routine felt different this morning. It wasn't just for him. He made another bowl of the bread mush, this time adding a spoonful of precious lard to it for richness. He placed it in the same spot as before. He sat at the small table, his back to the stove, and ate his own meager breakfast of dry bread. He tried to act normal, as if he were alone. He could feel her watching him. The feeling was a prickle on the back of his neck, a weight in the air behind him. After he finished, he stayed at the table, sipping hot water from a tin cup. He heard the faintest scuttling sound. He didn't turn. He heard the soft scoop of a hand in the bowl, the wet sounds of eating. He kept his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table. He was trying to teach her that his back was safe. This became their ritual. For 3 days he did not approach the stove. He did not speak. He simply provided food and water and retreated. He would leave the offerings and turn his back, or sit on his cot and pretend to mend a piece of leather. And each time, after a long, tense wait, she would emerge, eat, and retreat. He started to notice things, the way she moved with a fluid, silent grace that was unnerving, the way her head tilted when the kettle began to hiss, a look of cautious curiosity on her face. He saw her peek out once while he was adding wood to the cook stove, her eyes drawn to the flames, not with fear but with fascination, a child curled like a coal, ready to be lit. The thought returned to him, and this time it didn't feel so strange. On the 4th day, he decided to speak. He set the food down and went to his cot. "I put some lard in it today," he said to the empty room. His voice sounded like a shovel scraping rock. "It's good for you. Keep you warm." He expected her to stay hidden, spooked by the sound. But after a few minutes of silence, her small face appeared in the opening. She stared at him for a long time before creeping out to eat. It was a victory so small it was almost invisible, but it felt monumental. He started talking to her more, not asking questions, just narrating his day in a low, even murmur. "Wind's picking up from the north. Might see a dusting of snow." Or, "Need to chop more wood soon. The pile's getting low." He talked about the cabin, about the mountains, about the way the light changed on the eastern peaks in the morning. He never talked about himself. He never talked about Martha. Those words were still frozen solid. He was creating a wall of sound, a gentle buffer against the crushing silence. One afternoon, he was cleaning his rifle. The familiar weight of it, a small comfort. He had it in pieces on the table when he felt her eyes on him. He glanced over his shoulder. She was not in the stove. She was standing just beside it, half hidden by its bulk, watching his hands as they worked the oil-soaked cloth over the steel barrel. It was the first time she had been out of the stove while he was awake and moving. He didn't acknowledge her. He continued his work, his movements slow and precise. He could feel her inching closer. He could hear the whisper of her bare feet on the dusty floor. She stopped a few feet behind him. He finished with the barrel and began to reassemble the firing mechanism, the clicks of the metal parts falling into place the only sound. He finished, set the rifle aside, and began to wipe his hands on a rag. He still didn't look at her. He went to the water bucket, dipped a cup, and drank. He could feel her presence right behind him. He turned slowly. She was standing there, a tiny, filthy wisp of a thing. Her hair was a tangled mat. Her dress was stiff with grime, but her eyes, fixed on his face, were clear and fiercely intelligent. She held something out to him on her small, flat palm. It was the gray feather, the one he had tossed into the firebox of the cook stove. It was singed at the edges. She must have retrieved it. She was returning his gift, or showing him what she had saved. He reached out, his large, rough hand trembling slightly, and took the feather from her. His fingers brushed her skin. It was cold, but it was skin. It was real. He looked from the feather to her face. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't respond. She just stared at him. Then her gaze dropped to the floor. With her big toe, she began to draw in the thick dust. A line, then another, intersecting it, then a circle. She was drawing a map. A crude, simple map of the cabin. A square for the room, a smaller square for the big stove, another for the cook stove, a rectangle for his cot. Then she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She was showing him her world, the boundaries of her existence, and he was in it. He crouched down, his knees popping. "That's the cabin," he said, his voice thick. He pointed a finger at the square. "And that's the stove." He pointed to her drawing of her home. She watched his finger, then looked back at his face. For the first time, her expression softened from pure feral vigilance into something that resembled curiosity. She was a child, after all. He named her in his head that day. He couldn't keep calling her the girl. He thought of the way she'd survived, hidden and silent in the cold and the dark, like a fern pushing its way up through the forest floor in a place with no sun. "Fern," he whispered to the quiet room long after she had retreated back to her iron den. It felt right. Their life fell into a new, strange rhythm. She grew bolder. She would stay out of the stove for longer periods, always watching him, a small shadow at the edge of his vision. She explored the cabin in her silent way, touching things with a reverent curiosity. She ran her tiny, dirty fingers over the carved back of Martha's empty chair. She touched a faded calico dress of Martha's that still hung on a peg on the wall. He watched her, a knot of old pain tightening in his chest. He expected to feel anger, a violation of sacred space. Instead, he felt a strange sense of continuity. The dress had not been touched in 3 years. Now, a living hand was tracing its pattern. One evening, as a bitter wind rattled the window frame, he saw her shiver. She was sitting on the floor near the still cold stove, her arms wrapped around her thin legs. The rag she wore offered no protection. The cold was setting in for the night, a deep, penetrating cold that even his layers of wool couldn't fully repel. He couldn't let her sleep in the iron box again. Not in this cold. Not anymore. He got up and went to the chest at the foot of his cot. He opened it. The smell of cedar and thyme rose up. Inside, folded neatly, were Martha's things, her winter shawl, her wool blankets. He hadn't looked at them since he'd packed them away. His hands hesitated. It felt like a betrayal. But the sight of the small, shivering girl overrode the ghosts. He pulled out a small, thick wool blanket woven with faded red and blue stripes. He walked over to her. She saw him coming and scrambled back, her eyes wide with alarm, ready to bolt for the stove. "Easy," he said, his voice low. "Easy now, Fern." He knelt, holding the blanket out. "It's for you. It's warm." She stared at the blanket, then at him. He didn't move closer. He just laid it on the floor between them. He retreated to his cot and sat down, turning his back slightly, pretending to be occupied with a buckle on his boot. He listened. He heard the soft rustle of the wool. He risked a glance. She had crept forward and touched the blanket with one finger, as if testing it. Then she snatched it and scurried not to the stove, but to the dark corner behind Martha's chair. There, she wrapped herself in it, a small striped bundle in the shadows. She had accepted another piece of his world, of Martha's world. That night, for the first time, she did not sleep in the stove. He knew he couldn't keep her hidden forever. His supplies were running low. The half-empty flour sack was a constant reminder of the world beyond Old Smelter Row. The town, what was left of it, was a few miles down the canyon. It was little more than a general store, a saloon, and a church with a leaning steeple, populated by a handful of hardy souls, too stubborn or too poor to leave. He'd gone only when absolutely necessary, a silent specter stocking up on flour, salt, and cartridges, exchanging curt nods with Hatcher, the storekeeper, and leaving as quickly as he'd come. Now, he had to buy more. Significantly more. Lard, beans, maybe some dried apples, things a child could eat, things that would put flesh back on her bones. The thought of Hatcher's shrewd, curious eyes made his stomach tighten. Questions would be asked. But Fern was growing stronger, and her hunger was a good sign. It had to be done. He waited for a day when the sun broke through the clouds, a rare and welcome event. He put on his heavy coat and hat. Fern watched him from her corner, her small face tense. She knew the ritual of his departure, but this time felt different. He could feel her anxiety. He stopped at the door. "I'll be back before evening," he said to her. "Don't you worry. I'll bolt the door from the outside." He looked at the stove, then back at her. "Stay out of sight, just in case." Her eyes, wide and dark, followed him as he pulled the heavy door shut. The sound of the iron bolt sliding into place echoed in the sudden silence of the cabin. It was the first time he'd locked her in. It was for her protection, but it felt like caging her. The walk to town was cold, the air sharp in his lungs. He kept his head down, his hat pulled low. The town felt louder, more crowded than he remembered, though there were only a few figures on the muddy street. Hatcher was behind the counter, a portly man with a face like a worried potato. "Meryl," Hatcher grunted by way of greeting. "Thought a bear got you." "Not yet," John said, his voice a low rasp. He handed over his list. Hatcher's eyebrows went up as he read it. "Stocking up for a long winter?" he asked, his eyes lingering on the quantity of flour and the request for dried apples. "Something like that." John kept his gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "Heard strange things from up your way," Hatcher said, weighing out beans. "Jedediah Price said he saw smoke from your cook stove chimney regular-like. Said it's more than a man alone needs." John's hand tightened into a fist in his pocket. "I like a warm cabin." "And young Timmy, the trapper's boy, said he saw tracks round your place. Small ones. Too small for you." The air grew thick. John could feel the weight of Hatcher's suspicion. "Coyotes are getting bold," he said, his voice flat. Hatcher grunted, unconvinced. He finished bagging the supplies. The cost was more than John had spent in the last 6 months. He paid in silence, gathered the heavy sacks and left without another word. He could feel Hatcher's eyes on his back all the way out the door. He walked fast on the way home, his heart pounding with a new kind of fear. Not the hollow fear of loneliness, but the sharp, protective fear for someone else. They knew, or they suspected. And in a town this small, suspicion was as good as fact. It would travel from the store to the saloon to the church. A widower, living like a hermit, suddenly buying food for 2. Small tracks. They would put the pieces together, and they would come. When he got back to the cabin, the sun was low, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and red. He fumbled with the bolt, his fingers numb with cold and anxiety. He pushed the door open. "Fern?" he called out, his voice tight. The cabin was silent. The blanket he had given her was in a heap in the corner. The room felt empty. A cold dread, colder than the wind, washed over him. Had she gone? Panicked? Fled back to whatever hell she had come from? He stepped inside, dropping the sacks on the floor. "Fern!" He looked towards the stove. The door was shut. He rushed to it, his boots loud on the floor. He pulled at the iron handle. It was stuck. He pulled harder, and it groaned open. She was inside, curled into a tight ball, her face hidden, trembling. She had returned to the only safety she had ever known. Seeing him leave had terrified her, and she had retreated to her cold, iron womb. His heart broke. Not with the old, familiar grief for what was lost, but with a new, sharp agony for what was present. He knelt down, the floorboards groaning. "It's all right," he said, his voice cracking. I'm back now." He didn't touch her. He just knelt there, his presence a shield. "I brought apples, dried apples." Slowly she uncurled. Her face was streaked with fresh tears that had cut clean channels through the grime on her cheeks, her ash-streaked cheeks. She looked at him, her chest heaving with silent sobs. She crept out of the stove and, without hesitation, crawled into his lap. She buried her face in his rough wool coat and clung to him, her small body shaking. He froze, every muscle tensed. He hadn't held another person in 3 years. Her weight was startling, her warmth a shock. Tentatively, he raised a hand and placed it on her back. He could feel her ribs, her fragile spine. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed. The ghosts in the room were silent. For the first time, a living, breathing soul was pushing them back. He held her, patting her back in a clumsy, unpracticed rhythm, until her trembling subsided, and she was just a warm weight against his chest, breathing softly. He had gone to town to buy food to keep her alive, but in that moment, holding the terrified child, he knew it was he who was being saved. The peace was short-lived. 2 days later, they came. He saw them from the window, 3 figures making their way up the path to his cabin. He recognized them immediately. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority came more from the tin star on his coat than from any force of character. The Reverend Michael, whose piety was a thin veneer over a core of rigid judgment. And with them, Sarah Price, Jedediah's wife, a woman who considered herself the moral compass of the town. John's blood ran cold. He turned from the window. Fern was by the hearth of the little cook stove, drawing in a patch of spilled ash with her finger. She had been getting braver, even making small, soft sounds, not words, but hums of contentment as she played. She looked up at him, sensing the sudden tension in his body. Her eyes went wide with fear. "Hide," he whispered, his voice urgent. "The stove. Go." She didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled across the floor and vanished into the black mouth of the big stove, pulling the door almost shut behind her, leaving just a crack. It was a practiced, desperate movement that tore at his heart. He turned back to the door just as a heavy fist pounded against it. "Myrtle, open up! Sheriff Brody." John took a deep breath. He walked to the door, his legs feeling strangely steady. He was no longer the hollow man he had been. He was a fortress, and he had something to protect. He opened the door just enough to block the entrance with his body. The 3 of them stood there, their faces grim and set. The winter sun was harsh, leaching the color from the landscape and their faces. "Sheriff," John said, his voice even. "Reverend, Mrs. Price." "We need to come in, Merrill," Sheriff Brody said, trying to peer past him. "We've had reports, troubling reports." "My cabin's my own," John said. He didn't move. "This ain't about your cabin," Sarah Price cut in, her voice sharp as broken glass. "It's about the child. We know you have one in here. Hatcher told us what you bought. Timmy saw the tracks. It's not right. A wild thing living in a place like this, with a man like you, alone." The insult, which would have slid off his hollow shell a month ago, now struck a spark. "A man like me? A recluse," the Reverend said, his voice smooth and condescending. "A man lost in his grief. It's no place for an innocent child. The Lord's house, a proper family. That's what she needs. We have a place for her at the orphanage in the next county." They talked about her like she was a stray dog, an object to be moved, processed, and civilized. They spoke of proper and right, but their words were as cold and empty as the smelter stacks. They didn't see the feather, or the maps in the dust, or the way she had finally stopped shivering. They only saw a problem to be solved. "She's not going anywhere," John said. His voice was quiet, but it had the weight of granite. Sheriff Brody shifted his feet, uncomfortable. "Now, John, be reasonable. We're talking about the girl's welfare. We need to see her, make sure she's safe." "She is safe. Let us be the judge of that," the sheriff insisted, putting a hand on the door to push it open. Something inside John, a lock that had been rusted shut since Martha's last breath, finally broke. He shoved the door, hard. It slammed against the sheriff's hand. Brody yelped and pulled it back. "I said no," John growled, his voice a low thunder he hadn't heard in years. He stepped fully into the doorway, his frame filling it. He was taller than Brody, broader than the Reverend. The grief that had bent his shoulders was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective rage. "You are not coming in this cabin. You are not taking her." Sarah Price gasped, clutching the Reverend's arm. "Did you see that? He's violent. The child isn't safe with him. She's safer here than she'll ever be with you, John shot back, his eyes burning. You see filth in a recluse? You don't see a life being pieced back together? You don't see anything at all. You just want to tidy things up, put them in the right box so you don't have to think about them. Well, she's not a thing to be tidied. He looked past them, at the cold, uncaring mountains. He thought of the tiny hand curling around the nail, the fingernail scratches on the stovepipe, the terror in her eyes when she thought he had abandoned her, the trust she had placed in him when she crawled into his lap. All of it, a fragile, miraculous tapestry they were threatening to rip apart with their good intentions. "I'm warning you, Merle," the sheriff said, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "You're obstructing my duty. I can come back with more men." "You do that," John said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You bring whoever you want. This door will be barred. It's been open to ghosts for too long. Now it's closed." He stared them down, one by one. The sheriff, blustering but weak. The reverend, whose faith had no room for miracles found in soot and silence. The woman, whose morality was a weapon. They saw something in his eyes they hadn't expected. Not madness, not grief, but purpose. A terrifying, immovable purpose. After a long, tense moment, the reverend pulled at the sheriff's sleeve. "Perhaps we should retire for now, Sheriff. Reevaluate." Sheriff Brody, grateful for the out, nodded curtly. "This isn't over, Merle." They turned and walked away, their righteousness deflating with every step. John watched them until they were small figures against the vast, gray landscape. He stayed in the doorway, the cold air washing over him, feeling the solid wood of the doorframe under his hands. He had barred the door. For the first time in years, he had stood between his home and the world. He had chosen. He closed the door, and this time he slid the heavy wooden bar into place. The sound was final. A declaration. He turned and leaned his back against the door, his heart hammering, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. The cabin was utterly silent. Then he heard a small sound. The creak of the stove door. He looked over. Fern was creeping out of the stove. She stood for a moment in the middle of the floor, a small, soot-stained figure in the dim light. She looked at the barred door, then at him. Her face was impossible to read. Was she afraid of him now? Of the anger she had just witnessed? She walked slowly towards him. She didn't stop at a safe distance. She came right up to him, close enough that he could see the individual lashes framing her wide, dark eyes. She reached out a tiny, hesitant hand and laid it on his arm. She just rested it there, her small fingers a warm weight on his sleeve. It was not a gesture of fear. It was a gesture of solidarity, of understanding, an anchor. He looked down at her small hand, then into her eyes. The ghosts were gone. The cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary, and he was its keeper. That night, the quiet was different. It wasn't the silence of absence, but the shared peace of survival. He made a stew with the last of his salted meat and the new supplies. He set 2 bowls on the table. For the first time, he didn't wait for her to come to the food. He sat down and gestured to the other chair, Martha's chair. She hesitated, then slowly climbed onto it. Her feet dangled high above the floor. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against the tin bowls. He watched her eat. She was still ravenous, but her movements were less frantic, more deliberate. She held the spoon in her fist like a tool she was just learning to use. When she was finished, she looked at her empty bowl, then at him. A thin sheen of stew coated her chin. He felt the corner of his own mouth twitch. It was an unfamiliar feeling. He realized it was the beginning of a smile. Later, as the fire in the cook stove burned down to embers, she sat on her blanket in the corner, not sleeping, just watching the orange glow. He sat on his cot, cleaning the rusty kettle, polishing it with a cloth until faint glimmers of its original copper shone through. The air was warm and still. He didn't know her story. He didn't know where she came from or what horrors she had seen. He didn't know if she would ever speak. Maybe it didn't matter. The past was a landscape of ash. What mattered was the small, steady flame in the hearth, here and now. He banked the fire and lay down on his cot, pulling the rough blanket up to his chin. Fern was a small, still lump in her corner. He closed his eyes, expecting the usual long wait for sleep. But it came quickly, a deep and dreamless peace he hadn't known since before the world had gone quiet. He woke to a strange and wonderful smell, wood smoke, and warmth. A gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire cabin. It was not the localized heat of the little cook stove. It was a deep, radiant heat, the kind that sinks into your bones. He opened his eyes. A soft, flickering orange light danced on the ceiling. He sat up. The great cast-iron stove, the one that had been cold for 3 years, was alive. A fire burned merrily in its belly, its glow visible through the grate, and standing before it, her small silhouette framed by the light, was Fern. She was holding a small piece of kindling, her expression one of deep, solemn concentration. She opened the firebox door, the one she had hidden behind for so long, and carefully placed the piece of wood on the coals. The flames leaped up, illuminating her face. The ash was mostly gone now, washed away by the bowls of warm water he'd started leaving for her. Her cheeks were thin, but they had a touch of color from the heat. She was no longer a ghost from a cold tomb. She was the tender of the flame. He sat on the edge of his cot, the warmth washing over him, and watched her. She hadn't seen him wake. She closed the firebox door and stood back, her hands on her hips, appraising her work with a quiet satisfaction. She had reclaimed the space. The iron monster that had been her prison was now her tool. The source of her fear was now the source of their shared comfort. She never said thank you, just lit the stove the next morning before he woke.